There are a lot of questions to do with Noah and the flood and the ark. And some people look at that whole story and just say, well, if I've got to believe that, then I can't believe the rest of the Bible. And a lot of it's to do with maybe the number one point. Was the whole earth flooded, or was just a local area flooded? That's what we want to look at today. Maybe one of the first things you have to address is that it certainly says under the whole heaven and everything in the wording in Genesis chapter 6 and 7, chapter 7, that is that it was the whole earth. But often the Bible uses that term, and it doesn't actually mean the whole earth. And I'll maybe quote a couple of examples right here. One is in Romans chapter 1 and verse 8. It says, where Paul says, "First I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world." Well, in actual fact, the gospel at that particular time had not reached beyond the Mediterranean world. So when it says the whole world, it did not include Papua New Guinea. It did not include Tasmania. Another scripture is an example where the Bible uses such terminology is in Romans chapter 10, in verse 17 to 18. "So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. But I say, have they not heard? Yes, verily, their sound went into all the earth, and their words unto the ends of the world." Well, as we know, in the book of Romans at that particular time, the end of the world and all the earth was again the Mediterranean world. It did not include the natives of Latin America. They didn't hear anything about it. And maybe just one more example. There's plenty of them, by the way. One in Luke chapter 2 verse 1 says, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed." Now, as far as I know, the Australian natives, indigenous people, were not taxed by Caesar Augustus. And we know that that decree went throughout the Mediterranean world. So you can put to rest straight away. It says all the world means all the world. No, it doesn't necessarily. I also want to have a look at the thought that of the number of animals and the food that would be needed if you put all the animals of planet Earth, and by the way, they just would not fit. It was a big boat, no doubt, like a small cruise ship. There's no doubt about that. It was a big boat. But to fit all the animals of the planet was beyond its capability. So just quoting a bit from that story in Genesis chapter 6 verse 19, it says, "And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee, and they shall be male and female." And verse 20 says of Genesis chapter 6, "Of fowls after their kind, of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, 2 of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive." So he was obviously clearly instructed to bring in a number of animals, no doubt about that. Just reading on in verse 21 of the same story, Genesis chapter 6, "And take thou unto thee of all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee, and it shall be for food for thee and for them." As we read on, we find out that Noah only had 1 week to do that. And I did say the whole idea is that people have and it's a nice picture of Noah's Ark with elephants and giraffe. By the way, the floor-to-ceiling problem on the Ark would have been big with the giraffes and even with the elephants. It just talks about clean and unclean animals, and that's a real Bible term that's to do with what the children of Israel could eat and not eat. And the list is given fairly clearly in Leviticus chapter 11. But just reading chapter 7 now of Genesis, "Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by two, male and his female, of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and the female, to keep seed alive on the face of all the earth. So the whole sensible thought is that there was going to be a flood, and there was going to be a lot of devastation. But when the flood was over, Noah particularly, and his wife and his sons and their wives and so on, that there would be no food, there would be no domestic animals and so on. Everything points to the fact that the thought there was God's beef, if I can put it that way, was not with the Eskimos. It was not to do with the American Indians. His beef was with the descendants of Adam. And the whole targeting of those people were from the Garden of Eden, which was in the Mesopotamian Valley. And it was when the sons of Elohim, it says, came under the daughters of Adam. And it says the mixing of these two descendants of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, giants were born and people of great renown. But the big problem was then corruption entered in on the earth, and it was these people that God was angry with. And God said he wished he hadn't even made them. And he said he'd wipe them out, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So then we know God goes to Noah and says, you've got to build this big boat. It's going to take you 100 years to build it. Now and again, when I talk about this, people say, oh, well, God can do anything. We're talking about the fitting the animals into the ark or feeding them. That is true, but there's nothing in this story that indicates that anything miraculous or out of the ordinary happened. It wasn't as though suddenly, miraculously he fitted in the animals of the earth into the ark. No, it was a physical thing. Took Noah and his sons 100 years to build the ark. And then when it was all finished, he said, right, time to go in, time to bring the animals in. Now, as I mentioned in Leviticus chapter 11, you'll read the list of animals that are clean and animals that are not clean. Like it talks about in Leviticus chapter 11, animals like cattle, sheep and goats that have a cloven hoof and chew the cud. They were clean animals. Animals that might have even had one of those, like a pig, has a cloven hoof but doesn't chew the cud, or a camel actually chews the cud but doesn't have a cloven hoof. And animals like that, it gives a list of animals like rabbits or coney, or camels or pigs or horses or donkeys. They're not really there to be eaten, but the other ones were cattle and sheep and goats. If it's a sea life, it had to be a fish that had fins and scales. If it was a bird, it would be something like a turtle dove. The unclean birds were like birds of prey, eagles and hawks. Fish like squid or shark or prawns that don't have scales and don't have fins. You're not to eat them. Birds or maybe other scavenger type animals that were not to be eaten, like weasels or rats or mice or ferrets, and so it goes on. So the reason I'm bringing that up is that there's no indication that dangerous animals or big animals were brought in, like elephants or giraffes, or also some of the carnivores. There's no mention of animals like crocodiles or lions or tigers or Tasmanian devils or snakes or grizzly bears or hyenas, or I mentioned elephants and giraffes. None of them are mentioned as possible being there. But remember, God was taking Noah and his family out of danger, not into danger. So there's no mention of koala bears or kangaroos or kiwis or dingoes or sloths. No, it was clean and unclean animals, which the Bible does list. Now here's an interesting point. There's a little animal in Malaysia called a pen-tailed tree shrew, which lives on the nectar from a particular palm tree, which is alcoholic. And if this little animal doesn't have that, it doesn't survive. What about koala bears? The only food they eat is gum leaves, and they come from Australia. Now, Noah only had 1 week, 7 days to collect all the food for his family and for the animals he had on board. I mentioned fitting the animals into the ark. It appears as though there are at least 6,400 mammal species on planet Earth. And if you had 2 of each, that's 12,800 mammals you'll need in the ark. There are 900,000 types of insects. Now, if the whole Earth is covered in water, the insects need to be either on board or inboard of the ark as well. There are 10,000 species of reptiles. Overall, there are 8.7 million species of animals. Now, give us a break. They're not going to fit into the ark. No way, no. And Noah's got to feed them. So the whole thought there really is ridiculous. Now, let's just talk, maybe finishing about water. It appears as though the heaviest downpour of in a shower of rain is around 1.8 metres in a day. 1.8 metres. It only rained for 40 days. So if there was 2 metres a day of heavy downpour, that would only end up being 80 metres of water. Now that's enough. In the Mesopotamian Valley, that certainly would have been a massive flood and would have killed all the humans and all the animals in the region. But it would not cover Mount Everest. It does not indicate that this flood went all over the earth 5 miles up. In actual fact, at 2 metres a day, it would take over 12 years to cover the whole earth in water. So we don't have to have those ridiculous thoughts when all we've got to do is say it's a localised flood. The boat, the ark, was built in the Mesopotamian Valley. Nobody disputes that. They don't have it being built in the middle of Australia or somewhere. No, it was built in the Mesopotamian Valley, somewhere near where the Garden of Eden had been. And it rose, maybe it did rise about that 80 metres, we don't know. It certainly flooded the whole area. Now, when the ark lifted off, it was in the Mesopotamian Valley, and when the ark came down, it did not come down on Mount Kosciuszko in Australia. It did not come down on the Andes in Latin America or Mount Cook in New Zealand. No, it came down in the Mesopotamian Valley. It uses the word, the translation of the King James Bible uses the word mountains, but if you look up the word, it means hills or hill territory. It could be a mountain, but they indicate would be the region in the Mesopotamian Valley. And when the water started to abate, by the way, if the whole earth is covered in water, there's nowhere for it to abate. If you said it evaporated, now that would be a miracle. 5 miles or 8 kilometres of water. Like in Australia, we have a big lake called Lake Eyre, and it only fills up on rare occasions. But when it does, it's massive, but the maximum depth of Lake Eyre is only 2.4 metres, and yet it takes 6 months, but it's a long time, 6 months for it to evaporate. So the water can't run anywhere, for the whole earth is covered in water, and the thought of it evaporating is ridiculous. So it did abate. There's 2 big rivers in the Mesopotamian Valley, the River Euphrates, the River Tigris, and they would have drained eventually, and the whole valley would have eventually drained, all the flood would have drained away. And so we see the ark now settling on the mountains of Ararat, which is on the edge of the Mesopotamian Valley, and then the whole story makes sense. You don't have to have the whole planet covered in water. The Bible doesn't actually say that in terminology that we would understand today. It indicates a local flood, and the animals were local animals. They weren't dangerous animals. They needed horses, they needed donkeys, but they needed sheep and goats and all those animals to eat, to work, and so on. So there were clean and unclean animals. And eventually, it took nearly a year. Eventually, the boat came down, rested on the mountains of Ararat, and the family came out, the animals came out, and life started again in that region. Think about it.